Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. We've talked a lot about the improved defense of the Cleveland Browns, how the Browns have committed to playing smash mouth football, and this is going to, oddly enough, be related to what we're talking about today. How much of an upgrade going from worst in the NFL at a position to going to league average can be, and how meaningful of an upgrade that can be with points. And that makes me think about what I feel is now the Browns' number one biggest issue when it comes to their attempt to win football games in 2025. Now, again, I'm not looking at the Browns through the lens of a team that's going to be a Super Bowl champion this year or even contend to be a champion or a team that I even expect to make the playoffs. We aren't there right now. There's a lot that needs to be figured out, particularly on offense, before I can have any optimism in that direction. But if you want the Browns to win as many games as possible this year, well, it's impossible to ignore the fact that the Browns still have a pretty large kicker problem. Dustin Hopkins last year was not just bad, he was one of the worst kickers in football. He was 66% field goals on kicking last year. 66%. That was good enough to rank him 34th out of 36 eligible kickers. It puts him almost 20% below the league average mark, which I believe is 84% on all kicks. If we break down those percentages, the league average for those percentages and what the expectation is for a kicker to be league average, you get something like this, right? 20 to 29 yard field goals. Kickers are expected on average last year to make those at about 97%. Dustin Hopkins was about 75%, right? 30 to 39 yard field goals, you're expected to make those about 94% of the time. I believe Dustin was around 80% of the time. 40 to 49 yard field goals, you're expected to make those about 76% of the time to be league average. Last year, Dustin Hopkins was about 60%. And then 50 plus, you're expected to make about 70% of those kicks. Dustin was at 50%. And then extra points, you're expected to make 96. Dustin was in the 80s with his extra point percentage. So on every metric that you judge a kicker by, Dustin Hopkins was a massive disappointment for the Cleveland Browns last year, and one of the worst kickers in the NFL. Now, there are a lot of different solutions you can think of at the kicker position. Fortunately, this is a spot where it's not really an expensive problem to solve. It just takes willing to get a little creative and a little exotic with how you look for these kickers. And I have my own philosophy on that. And I know people always get a pun not intended kick out of me talking about kickers because people think I hate kickers. I just hate how people evaluate kickers, right? There's a large assumption that we really know what we're doing when it comes to kicker evaluations, and I just don't think the science is there, right? Like that's why I'm not a fan of drafting kickers. It's never really worked out for people, but I do understand a kicker is important for the Cleveland Browns, and it's super important for the Cleveland Browns this year when you're talking about the kind of football that the Cleveland Browns are going to play. Right, we're talking about playing smash mouth, low yield football. We're not going to be very explosive, right? We're going to be as explosive as Zydrunas Ilgauskas in 2007, right? No explosion in them knees, nothing. We're not about to have nothing, right? Maybe Jerry Jeudy makes some big plays here or there. Maybe Cedric Tillman makes some big plays here or there. Maybe a running back gets loose here or there. But we aren't going to be explosive, right? We're going to be pretty safe when it comes to the level of explosion we'll be giving out at Huntington Bank Field. And when you're not a very explosive team, You're probably not going to lead the league in touchdowns scored. You're probably not going to be in a position where you're scoring so many points that your kicker does not matter. The Browns are playing the kind of football that's going to put a lot of pressure on the kicker position. And that needs to be addressed, right? I think the Browns have massive issues on offense, right? First, I think they needed to revert back to something that they're more familiar with. They did that. Two, I think they needed to get a quarterback who can at least get closer to league average than they were last year. Joe Flacco can do that. I'm pretty confident in his ability to get you to league average. So there's that. And then the third biggest issue for the Browns offense is you had one of the worst kickers in all of football last year, who exasperated just how bad your offense was on top of everything else that was going on. And Dustin Hopkins kind of is the forgotten man in all the chaos last year, because admittedly, a lot of my focus has been on Deshaun Watson, because Deshaun Watson isn't the only reason the Browns sucked last year, but, a good chunk, right? The quarterback position and all, right? Deshaun and DTR, I think, are the two main culprits. Were two of the main reasons this team stunk last year. Now, they weren't the only reasons. Dustin Hopkins played a big role in that as well. And here's what I mean by Dustin Hopkins played a big role in that as well. If you look at the kicks that Dustin Hopkins needed to make to get to league average, we're talking about him making 5 more field goals and 2 more extra points. That is about 17 points that we lost because we employed Dustin Hopkins versus a league average kicker. A league average kicker, the Browns would have scored 17 more points. Do you know how much of a difference in the season 17 points would have made? That would have been enough to win the Browns 3 more games. And if we look at the beginning of the season, that means the Browns could have legitimately been like 4-2 to start the year if we just got better kicking. And if the Browns go 4-2 to start the year, who knows what that does to morale? Who knows what that does to the rest of the season? This is going to matter a lot this year. The Browns are going to not score a ton of points this year again. Now, hopefully they'll be much better than they were last year, but they're still not going to be in the top half of points scored more than likely offensively. So these field goal attempts are going to matter, right? And I don't know if I trust Dustin Hopkins to get you to those numbers, because Dustin Hopkins is an older kicker. He had the one magical year in 2023. He violently came back down to average. And maybe the Browns' thinking is like, hey, he was so bad last year that he has to straighten it up this year, right? I don't know how long of a leash they're planning to give Dustin Hopkins. But again, he cost you 17 points last year. You cannot have that happen this year. That will be the difference between this team going over 500 and winning 6 games, is your kicker performance, right? It's going to matter a ton because of the style of football you're playing. The margin of error is not large on offense, so you need a kicker to be able to close some of that margin of error. If you had a superstar quarterback, I could care less about having an erratic kicker, right? We got Joe Burrow at the helm. I'm not talking about the damn kicker. I don't care about the kicker, right? If it's coming down to the kicker, we got bigger problems. But we don't have a superstar quarterback. We have 2 rookies, a 40-year-old, and Kenny Pickett. Right? That's the type of team that's going to have to lean on their kicker. Now, I've laid out this problem. I've told you that this problem has cost the Browns 17 points last year, and just what that point cost can turn into when it comes to wins and losses during the season. So what is the solution, right? And this is a point I've made with quarterback. The difference of going from worst kicker in the NFL to league average kicker is much bigger than you assume, right? It makes a difference in more games than you would assume, right? 3 wins the Browns would have had if they just had league average kicker. I'm not even talking about Brendan Aubrey level kicker, right? One of the best kickers in the NFL. Like if the Browns had that, they probably win 4 or 5 more games than they did last year. And you're talking about a team that won 8 games instead of 3. That's the margin the Browns are playing with right now. Especially when we have a great defense. You're building a good run game, trying to be more physical. Field goals are going to matter. So how do you solve this problem? Where do you look for an answer? I've been banging this drum for a while, and there's a real reason why I've been banging this drum for a while. But the answer to the Cleveland Browns kicking problems, I think, lays in the hands of spring football. To me, it's so obvious why the transition from spring football kicker to NFL kicker has been one of the more successful spring to fall conversions that we have seen. If you look at the successful conversions from spring to fall football, it's usually kickers, right? Kickers who kick good in the spring tend to kick good in the fall. Why is this the case? I think there are a couple of reasons for it, right? That differentiate it from kicking good in college versus kicking good in the pros, right? Because we have seen that the college to pro transition is just not as successful. Dustin Hopkins is, ironically enough, a prime example of this, right? Dustin Hopkins, when he was coming out of Florida State, one of the best kicking prospects you ever seen, then wasn't really good when he got to the league until like a few years into his career. I think there are reasons for this, right? In college, kicking is a different game. The hashes are wider, which you can argue makes kicking the football more difficult, but teams aren't axing as much of you as a kicker, right? In the NFL, you might get some out there to kick 3 or 4 50-yard bombs, and they think you're supposed to make those. In college, anytime you kick anything above 40, it's hit or miss. And honestly, coaches understand those odds and are more willing to be more risky offensively. So go for it than just kick field goals in college football, right? So less stress is put on a kicker in college football. Also, the environment off the field is completely different, right? When you're an NFL kicker, your job is on the line every kick. Like, you can miss 3 kicks and be out of town the next week. You could have been that man, but miss 3 kicks, you over with, right? And that's the reality in the NFL. In college, if you miss 3 kicks, well, there's like 400 other specialists on the team. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but there's a lot of specialists. You ever look at a college roster, there's like 4 or 5 punters, there's like 7 kickers, there's kick-off specialists, there's like 3 long snappers. There's like 20 dudes on a college football roster that are just there to compete for the kicking job, either it be punting, kicking, long snapping, one of those jobs. There's like 20 dudes. There's a legitimate community in that locker room for those guys. So there's support, right? Like, there's somebody, you have a best friend who's also a long snapper. Maybe he's not the starting long snapper, but he's on the team still, right? If you miss 3 kicks and you play for LSU, they're not going to boot you off campus because you missed 3 kicks. This is not the same environment. There's a lot more comfort there. There's a lot less pressure on every kick, and teams are asking a lot less of you as a kicker on an individual basis. In the NFL, there are 3 specialists on the team. There's a punter, there's a long snapper, there's a kicker. That's it. You go from a community of 20 people to 3 dudes, and I'm going to be real with you. If you're a rookie kicker, there's a good chance that punter's like 38 and the long snapper's like 35, and y'all ain't got nothing in common. Right? So you really got no friends. You're on an island. It's much more lonely for a kicker on the NFL roster. I think that plays a role. What adds to the loneliness in the NFL for a kicker is the fact that you're never really going to be there for long. You're like 1 or 2 bad plays. You have the worst job security of any player on the team. If a quarterback throws 3 interceptions, he gets benched. If you miss 3 field goals, there's no room for you to get benched. You're cut. You're out of there. You have some of the worst job security on the team for at least somebody who's going to be as notable as you. Obviously, like a 5th linebacker on the team has worse job security than a kicker, but a kicker is the most notable player that can be cut easily during the year. So it's more pressure on every kick. NFL teams lean on their kickers more, so they axe more. They have less pressure. There's less of an environment supporting these kickers, and the job is just lonely, and it's very high pressure. And it's a lot. Like, think about the difference from going to college to the NFL. Now, let's look at spring football, where teams tend to lean on the kickers in the same percentages that they lean on kickers in the NFL. The hashes are the same hashes that you're expected to kick on in the NFL. One underrated element of spring football is that no matter where you're going to play, you're going to have to kick in inclement weather unless your team plays in a dome. Now in the UFL, what the Battlehawks play in a dome and the Panthers play in a dome, and I think the Brahmas play in a dome. So 3 teams kick in a dome, but even then you only get 4 home games, and all that other time you're kicking in spring weather, which can be rainy, windy. It's not cold like we think of inclement weather being, but it's still a lot of elements that you have to deal with, a lot of breezes that are pretty erratic that happen, especially in the South during the spring, that these kickers have to deal with. Also, the job is similarly as lonely in the UFL, if not more lonely. They have less people on a roster than it is in the NFL. There's not 20 guys there that you can kick it with, throw a little kegger with, if you miss a kick, make you feel better. There's 3 dudes there, all trying to get back to the NFL, all at different ages. So if you can get used to that environment in the UFL, kicking in the NFL is not really going to be that different. Is there more pressure on you? Sure. But you've probably been through that pressure if you're in the UFL already. So it's not new to you. I think the UFL, or spring football in general, is the perfect breeding ground to recruit kickers. I honestly wouldn't draft a kicker, but I would sign 3 UFL kickers every year. Every year. And if you look at 2 of the best kickers in the NFL, Jake Bates for the Detroit Lions and Brendan Aubrey for the Dallas Cowboys, no surprise, they got their start in the UFL. Or the XFL or the USFL, right? Spring football. I don't think that's really a coincidence, because if you really look at it, it makes a ton of sense. Now, I couldn't tell you technique-wise how to evaluate a kicker. I don't know anything about the fine details of kicking a football. If you want to know that, there's somebody on Reddit that'll tell you all that stuff. I'm just saying, I think those environmental factors are why it seems like it's so hard to translate fall college kicking to fall pro kicking. But then you look at spring kicking in the pros to fall kicking in the pros, and it seems to be a much more seamless transition. There are 2 kickers I have my eyes on. Now, unfortunately, the 2 best kickers in the UFL right now are also one of them is a dome kicker in Rodrigo Blankenship, and he's kicked in a dome pretty often throughout his career. I believe he played at Georgia, and then I think he played for the Colts for a while. Now he's playing for the Battlehawks, so he is a primarily indoor kicker, so that might sway how you feel about signing Rodrigo. I would give him a chance. And then Harrison Mevis from the Birmingham Stallions, who also seem to be a breeding ground for good kickers. So, go look at the 2 best kickers, or find who you think has the most impressive resume from the UFL, and to sign those guys to compete with Dustin and Hopkins. Anything less than that, I feel like, is setting this team up to be really disappointed in the kicker position again. And the Browns just can't afford, if they want to have a good win-loss record, to have any sway in their kicker. One of the things underrated about Pittsburgh, right? People talk about Mike Tomlin is the reason that the Steelers tend to always go above 500. I don't really think it's Mike Tomlin as much as it is Chris Boswell. And that's not to say I'm overrating what a kicker brings to the team, but if you look at the margins in which Pittsburgh wins by, and then you look at how well Chris Boswell performs in pressure kick situations and in kicking situations, you're going to see a direct line there, right? If Chris Boswell was a worse kicker, the Steelers would have had a couple of under 500 seasons. But since Chris Boswell is a really good kicker, he makes high pressure kicks on consistency, and he's been there forever. So they've had that consistency at kicker for a while. It allows them to play this low yield style of football and still maintain a 500 record, because they can clean up and get all those field goals. That's why Mike Tomlin loves kicking field goals. I think Boswell is as big a part of that success as Mike Tomlin is. And I honestly think probably even more than that, right? If we're talking about them not being under 500, Chris Boswell's a huge part of that. And if you want to play that kind of football, you got to have a good kicker. And Dustin Hopkins, what he did last year, gives you a massive concern about his ability to provide you with that consistency. So if I'm the Browns, you got to look other ways. I know they brought in a kicker to compete with Dustin during mini camps, but once this UFL season ends, I think you should bring in 2 kickers from the UFL. And I know people go, 2 kickers? You want to bring in 2 kickers to the 90-man roster? Yeah, I would. What else we got to lose, right? I would bring in 2 extra kickers, bring in the 2 best guys from the UFL, have them battle it out with Dustin Hopkins. I think there's a good chance that you end up with somebody who can at least give you league average at kicker, hopefully better. You know, maybe you hit a home run like they did with Jake Bates or like the Dallas Cowboys did with Brendan Aubrey. But spring kicking experience seems to translate better to fall kicking experience, and I think that's something to keep in mind going forward. But yeah, the Browns need to fix their kicker problem. Maybe this is how they do it.